Thank you so much, everybody at Life, the Universe, and Everything. I'm so excited to be here and be able to kind of talk about writing and share, the little I've figured out over the years. And I'm gonna kind of spend this time discussing one element that I've always understood was incredibly important to my writing, but I think that the kind of centrality it has to my development as a writer has really been borne home to me over the last few years, especially since 2014 when I moved to Mexico. So, and then after I give this presentation, hopefully there'll be a little time for anyone who would like to ask questions. So, picture the scene. You're at a party, chatting over hors d'oeuvres. The person before you asks you what you do for a living. So you're feeling brave that day and you say, "Oh, I'm a writer." "Oh, what kind of writer?" Your conversation partner's eyes light up. A novelist, you say, perhaps a little hesitantly. This person looks a little too eager. Their fangs sharp. They pounce. "A novelist! That's wonderful. Would you believe that I've had the most amazing novel idea for ages, but I'm not much of a writer. How about I give it to you and we split the profits 50-50? Whew. So you might rumble that you have a very important commitment with a fern in the corner and hustle out of there. I don't know about you guys, but I have definitely been in that situation more times than I wish. And it's common and awkwardly hilarious because, of course, the writing is the work. As the kind of everyone says, anyone can get an idea. And this is true. But I do think that idea shortchanges the real skill involved, not in precisely having an idea, which is just what modestly creative brains do, but in cultivating an idea, which is what the best writers do, whether consciously or not. So how do you cultivate an idea? While this requires skill, it isn't one that can be broken down into simple rules, nor is it one that would be very amenable to workshops or boot camps. Retreats, maybe. It's a skill, but it's a holistic, fuzzy one that's hard to pin down. But throughout my career, I have come again and again to the truth that this strange, intangible skill is the one that I have needed to rely upon the most and spend the most time developing long after I could more or less competently draft clean narrative prose. So, a little background about me. In 2014, I had recently finished 2 YA novels back to back. Those are The Summer Prince and Love is the Drug. They were very different from one another. One took place in a futuristic kind of analog, very different, but the coast of what is now Brazil, and the other one was a near future dystopian thriller about a global flu pandemic and political upheaval. That was one of those times where you end up writing things that you kind of hope never come to pass, and then you start living through it, and it's surreal. So they're very different from one another, but what they had in common was a core spark, an absolute conviction that they were stories that I needed to tell and that only I could tell. They were both born of years of thinking long before I drafted a word, years of a creative process that I've called composting. So this is more or less, I read an article about one thing, or I watch a documentary, I read books, I learn another language, and these are all sources that, superficially really have nothing to do with one another. But they kind of go into the back of my brain. So like this compost heap of my brain. And eventually, sometimes, right, an interesting idea pops out. I had largely allowed this process to go on unexamined behind the scenes of my conscious mind. but in 2014, I had a bit of a life rupture, and I was both at loose ends and not under any explicit deadline pressure. Just to say, I was not under contract. I certainly had the pressure of needing to eat, but I didn't have anybody who had guaranteed me any kind of publication. So I felt, based on my relative success with the 2 YA novels, that I should get on top of writing a new YA novel as soon as I could. And so I diligently wrote notes on an idea that had been sort of lifting its head above the waterline of my subconscious without particular energy, but I liked the look of it, and I decided I could make it work. I call this my failed 80s novel. It sounded so cool on paper, but at the end of the day, I think it was a little too on the paper, as it were. I couldn't make the trompe l'oeil, I couldn't make the illusion work, giving it depth, right? But it had 80s like post-punk scene, and it had artists and kind of alien fairies and doorways, and everything about it was so cool, but I just couldn't write it. 6 months later, I had 30,000 words that went nowhere, practically a nervous ulcer, and a novel whose main character was more boring than a stick of wood. Honestly, now that I've been living in the country, let me amend this. Sticks of wood are vastly more interesting and varied and individual than that dude. So the idea that had seemed totally fine had burned itself out before I'd even gotten started. So what did I do? You guys, I was really, at a crossroads. I'd moved to Mexico. I was not under contract. I had to make this decision of continuing with this idea that I could not make work. The idea was just kind of strange and inert, or what, right? And I decided to cut my losses. I had another idea, you see, one that had been burning in the back of my mind that whole time, immolating itself in its need to make me turn around and look at it. I had dismissed it because it was an adult novel and had a weird plot structure and was really depressing in a lot of ways. But the fact is, I wanted to write it. That was an idea that would be worth the time. And I have to say, right, what would be worth the time has to be about as subjective a decision as there is in a career filled with incredibly subjective decisions. And I think perhaps because we're aware that it's such a subjective decision, one that's tied, for better or for worse, often with less subjective decisions, with kind of more monetary or survival decisions, it can kind of get lost that while it's a subjective decision, it's perhaps like the most important one, like what is worth my time to write? And like I said, there's all sorts of reasons and all sorts of things that can influence that. But at the end of the day, you have to feel that very deeply, right? Because otherwise it's it's a slog, right? It's 30,000 words in 6 months on a book, and you have no idea who the main character is. So I cut my losses. I had So I cut my losses, and I gave up on the YA novel that couldn't, and I gave myself the chance to work on this new novel. And lo and behold, my mojo came right back. I mean, I'd really started to wonder. I'm not sure there was a writer who has not wondered, have I lost it? I just don't know how to write anymore. It's just not working. Everything is a slog. There's a lot of reasons for that. Some of them really have nothing to do with a novel in question, but sometimes they absolutely do. And though this particular novel took a long time and many revisions, I will say I never lost that spark, that mojo, that I can definitely write this book. And, I knew that it was going to take a long time. I knew that it was going to be one of those books I had to revise a lot. That was actually one of the reasons I'd been hesitant to focus on it. I knew that writing it would tax my abilities as a writer more than any previous project. But I did it, and it took about 6 years, all told, maybe like 6 to 7. Honestly, you kind of lose track at some point. But that book came out in July of last year as Trouble the Saints, my first novel in 6 years. So, because Love is a Drug came out in 2014. This experience has made me far more appreciative of the skill involved in idea cultivation, which is what I want to dig into a little more here with all of you. What I'm going to talk about can be broken down into roughly 2 complementary activities: interrogating your own imagination and cultivating your imagination. So let's start with interrogation. What do I mean? Interrogating your imagination. It sounds kind of scary. Doesn't have to be, could be. What I mean is, because we are creatures of a very particular time and circumstance, now this is true of everybody, every human, can't get out of it. We use our own necessarily limited experience to imagine what is possible. If you don't expand your knowledge of what is possible, you're far too likely to stick in very well-trod grooves. And sometimes those grooves have some pretty problematic implications. So let's try to make this a little more concrete, right? Let's take a classic fantasy, Western, historic, hey, even modern action movie trope. A stranger walks into a bar. Now, you're probably picturing something right now, even as I'm speaking. Depending on the contours of your imagination, you might see a 40s juke joint, a medieval tavern complete with grim mercenaries playing dice, or a country dive bar with a cigarette machine and a grungy pool table. So keep that picture in mind wherever you first went. And what would you probably write, if the description of the bar weren't particularly important to the plot? Which is to say, if the bar is going to be the kind of central set piece of your novel, one naturally tends to, as a writer, dig in and interrogate a little those assumptions, interrogate that idea, right? But what tends to happen is that when things are kind of incidental, when they're in passing, we're in the background, that kind of initial image that pops up tends to be, or often is, the image that ends up on the page. And that's how a lot of culture and cultural tropes, we call them, or expectations, or norms end up replicating themselves. And this isn't, it's a neutral process. Often it's perfectly benign. The only thing that suffers is maybe, that you could have a slightly more interesting tavern, but often, again, not always, but often those assumptions, that kind of groove can carry along with it a lot of implications that you as a writer are not thinking about. You're just replicating because it's part of the culture that you are from. And so you reproduce it because that's what humans do. Like I said, nothing wrong with that. But as writers, we do have an obligation to understand the context in which we are writing, the context we come from, and the context, of the impact that writing is going to have or could have on the individuals who read it and on the culture in general. So back to a stranger walking into a bar. How do we interrogate it? Start with some basic questions. Where is the bar? That could tell you, might differentiate between your 40s era juke joint, your medieval tavern, right? What are they serving there? How do they serve it? Who are the servers? I'm a big fantasy nerd. I've read big fat fantasy novels since I was a young child, and I think all of us fantasy fans know that there is a kind of perhaps too great dependence on the serving wench in these kind of nondescript taverns. And at the point at which I started paying attention to that, it was one of those things where you don't pay any attention to it at all, and then suddenly all you're seeing is serving wenches, because they just kept popping out. And I realized, it was just part of the kind of furniture of a tavern for so many of us growing up and reading those books and in this culture. But it carries a lot of problematic associations, right? Like, who is sitting, who is standing, who is high status and who is low, like it's back to the serving wench question. And how are you showing that? Are you replicating the attitudes, perhaps classist, perhaps racist, perhaps sexist attitudes of the characters in how you were describing those people in the bar? Because there's one thing to have a society that is that has sexism or racism in it, and it's another thing to write a text that implicitly or explicitly supports that, right? So you can even get to other kind of a kind of different tack, like how do people pay? Like, do they even have money? So those are questions that can shake us up a little. But yeah, and if you just interrogate that, honestly, you've really done a great deal of work in making and deepening the believability, and deepening the kind of depth of world building. Because one of the kind of side effects of kind of pushing this kind of mental background furniture into a story without examining it is that you make that aspect of the story to the reader itself seem like something that they've seen before, and they skim it in that kind of, not necessarily with their skimming the page literally, but they're slotting it into a scene that they've seen or read dozens or 100 times before. That scene automatically becomes another one on the palimpsest of scenes. And that will, if done over and over again, weaken the writing. Like I said, it's everything that that we can do is not necessarily good or bad, and this isn't necessarily bad either, but it is something that is useful to interrogate, right? So especially, but it might be necessary to, or even advisable to, go down another level, especially when you're writing explicitly speculative genres like science fiction or fantasy. So those questions might be, is this a world? And where you live, wherever it is a world in exactly the same way that Westeros is, right? Where the term bar makes cultural sense. Is alcohol prohibited? Is it limited to certain castes or classes? Do people have money? Is it barter? Do people even think of going to establishments for food and drink as a viable method of eating, or is eating really considered an activity of the home? The whole notion of what's private and what's public is something that absolutely changes culturally, and I think often those are questions that we as writers can easily let kind of, again, fall into this kind of furniture of the mind. And those are the kinds of questions that I think is very useful to be able to interrogate. Just kind of briefly about the do people go to establishments for food and drink? I've always been interested in this question, as a fantasy writer, because from a young age, I was, obviously wanted to be a writer, and I had these ideas of wanting stories like the ones I was reading, but with different people and with a kind of different or broader kind of slice of cultures, like the ones that I of my own family and of other people. And a lot of what I've done as an adult has been a lot of kind of looking around and examining things and learning about different cultures. And one of the things that I have learned in my master's degree at UNAM in Mexico was that, this notion of a restaurant or a bar is far from a universal notion, and there is really kind of nothing equivalent in pre-Columbian Mexico. There were establishments. There was a great market. There were places to go and eat and buy even pre-prepared food, but there wouldn't have been a bar in the way that, or a tavern in the way that we're thinking of it. So you, as a science fiction or a fantasy writer, trying to base a fantasy novel on the pre-Columbian Mexica or the Aztecs, wouldn't be able to use that kind of like easy mental furniture that we're so familiar with from our more Western fantasy novels. And if you do, you end up kind of putting a discordant element, one that does not ring true with the rest of the world building. And I think that's one of the best things that interrogating your ideas can do. It puts it makes you re-examine exactly what you're doing on the page, not necessarily throw it all out, but to make sure that you're not just doing it because that's the way that you're used to seeing it, right? So it's especially important to interrogate your imagination when you're imagining people and places with whom you do not have direct experience. So this goes to, outside of your own culture, outside of your own time period, outside of your professional sphere. For that matter, if you're going to have a novel where people are shooting guns all the time and you don't know much about guns, you're going to have to interrogate your imagination around what is possible and what is reasonable in a gunfight, right? This is not in any way exclusive to writing other cultures or other time periods. And this is exactly for that exact same reason. This is where research comes in. So research is books, but it's also movies and travel and friendships, and also just genuine time spent with the world you want to create. I really can't overemphasize the importance of sitting with your world and kind of slowly, methodically, lovingly even going through all of those little details over the course of writing, even in the course of revision. In fact, during revisions is probably one of the best places you have to be able to really go back and start interrogating those things, because these aren't things that necessarily at the drafting stage you're going to be able to like maintain in your head at the exact same time. But writing, thankfully, unlike some other arts, like where you kind of have to get it all right the first time, or you're on stage, you can go back. You can go back as many times as you need to go back, and I think that's hugely important in this kind of interrogation, because I think as any writer knows, the idea isn't just I got the idea and now I'm going to write the novel. The ideas are part of the writing process. You get the spark of the idea, and then it goes into different iterations. You as you're revising, you suddenly connect one element to another element, and you realize that you need to research this other element. All of that is exactly part of what I'm talking about, right? The interrogating of your ideas and the cultivation of your ideas, which I'm going to get to. But it's hugely important to at some point, wherever it feels natural in your writing process, to take a step back and start this process of interrogation. So, and as I said, among the reasons that it's very important is an increasing awareness and of increasing your awareness of and sensitivity to racist and sexist and colonialist tropes, among others. When a broader way of saying this would be tropes that needlessly inflict harm on others. In fantasy, these are historically a particularly common pitfall. Often, if you're not in the group directly affected, some of the most offensive overtones can escape you, but they still hurt just as much, which is to say it's still your responsibility. A good example of a writer who's very problematic is J.K. Rowling's anti-Semitic depiction of goblins. It also totally came out in the movie as well, it has its immediate roots, that depiction, in 19th century fantasy fables like Christina Rossetti's The Goblin Market. Still, it was her responsibility to realize that and not reproduce the same anti-Semitism. For all that might have come as part of her particular furniture of how to think about goblins, that doesn't stop it from being anti-Semitic, right? Which is why it's so important to be able to cultivate this habit of interrogating one's ideas. And there's a third level, by the way, at which you can interrogate your ideas. Modern publishing and narrative storytelling generally has become very tied to a culturally specific kind of story structure, the 3-act structure, in which a protagonist is confronted with a problem, fights to find a solution to the problem, experiences setback, and eventually triumphs over the problem. In the margins of many a budding author's work, you can find exhortations for their protagonists to do more and not be passive in their own stories. You can even hear this pithily summed up as the protagonist must protag. But here's the thing. This is only one kind of story, specific to one culture. There's so many other kinds of stories, ones of quiet resistance, of deciding to survive in a world hostile to your survival, or picaresque tales, where the protagonist flits from one adventure to another, whose continuity has more to do with the protagonist's idiosyncratic internal journey than some overarching plot MacGuffin. And these are all valid stories. I really cannot emphasize this enough. I have no animus towards the 3-act structure. It has served me well, but I think that we Western culture has a very strong tendency to impose its ideals on its ability to appreciate and understand any other culture. And that is where interrogating your ideas is very important, especially because often in this case, that kind of protagonist must protag and the character must always be acting on the story implicitly disenfranchises telling the stories of people who are not in positions of power, for whom protagging might, implicate that they are killed or lynched or beaten or abused in some way, and it implicitly implies that those stories aren't worth telling, and it means that the market for stories is kind of like axiomatically biased towards certain kinds of people. And so it's as if we take our ideas and we prune at the very root, the very base of the idea, the notion that a queer Black woman could be the protagonist of a story. We prune at the root, the very idea that you could tell the story of the conquest of Mexico from the point of view of an indigenous person. From the point of view of somebody who is not necessarily going to be able to have the power or the agency to protag in a way that that particular story structure recognizes, which is not to say that they are not doing things in their own lives and do not have tremendous gravitas, and those stories aren't tremendously interesting, but it does require us to examine our assumptions of what kinds of stories are valid and not neuter them before they can even get off the ground, right? So sometimes our ideas seem strange to us because they don't follow the traditional formula. That's what happened to me with Trouble the Saints. I knew that it was a very strange structure, and I kind of shied away from it. I shied away from it because I understood that it was not following that particular traditional or accepted story structure, and I kind of had I had absorbed so much of that. My particular furniture of what a story is allowed to be had become kind of so overpowering that I ended up trying to cut at the root one of, a story that deeply spoke to me. And I think we do great harm to our creativity by trying to force these interesting, odd ideas that often formed from parts of us that are separated from the mainstream into some elusive commercial viability. That's not what stories are for. That's not what ideas are for. They come from you, and they must, in the end, respect who you are and not what or who other people wish you to be for their own convenience. Let me be clear. This is constant work. You don't do it once and call it a day. This is something you can do better or you can do worse, but you can't get it completely right, like checking a box in a list. It is a practice. And cultivating the sensibility in your practice will, I guarantee you, slowly but surely, dramatically improve your fiction. It is important because we don't want to put more racist and sexist and ableist and all sorts of other axes of oppression garbage into the world compost heap and have it regurgitated back at our most vulnerable populations. But it's also important because this is the very work that makes your worlds leap off the page, become not only believable, but vibrantly alive in the hearts of readers. Interrogate your imagination, and you create the conditions for your garden to grow different, interesting, thought-provoking fruit. Which leads me to the second half of this more holistic writing practice, cultivating your imagination. If interrogation is pulling the weeds and critically examining the other plants to determine how well they fit your vision, cultivation is planting those judicious seeds. It's finding like-minded gardeners with whom you can share ideas and exchange cuttings. It's tilling the soil and judging the light and shadow and actively creating the conditions in which the best story that only you can write can grow. So how do you cultivate your imagination? Expose it to a wide variety of experiences. There's all sorts of ways to do this, and no one way will be accessible or advisable for everyone. I'm not advocating some kind of grand world tour for fantasy writers, or you're not a real writer, whatever that means. I'm saying that however you prefer to engage the world, a key to cultivating your imagination is to make that engagement diverse along as many axes as you can think of. If you usually only read fantasy, give a few memoirs a try. If you like to travel, stay an extra week after the tour is over and try to get a feel for the rhythms of a different place. Learn a new language. Experiment with different music or artistic styles. Do something that gives you that little hiccup in your heart, that frisson in the gap between what you've overlooked and what you can almost see. That feeling, that liminal state of pure curiosity, of openness, and willingness to learn is the richest fertilizer, the heirloom seeds, the pure water that will nourish the garden of your imagination and allow your most brilliant stories to flower. Only you can know what will give you that magical feeling, just as only you can tell the stories that flow from the ideas you have so carefully cultivated, which brings us back to our cocktail party interlocutor. For all we know, that story that they have is every bit as brilliant as they think. The trouble is that they're the ones who need to write it. I'm just trying to tell you not to take the ideas for granted. They are part of the writing process every bit as much as our techniques of putting them on the page are. And while it's a process that's a lot more intuitive, fussy even, there's a benefit to cultivating a practice that allows you to harvest your best ideas. All the technical skill in the world won't help you in the service of a lousy idea. Develop those technical skills. And let's be honest, they also require a heap of this kind of ideal cultivation in smaller ways. But don't neglect your garden, your compost heap, and those stuttering gasps of your heart when it discovers and loves something new. So I would love to take questions the last 10 minutes if anybody has any. Okay.
So I love what you say about interrogating versus cultivating your imagination, particularly examining our assumptions. What books and or media sources would you recommend to our audience as to broaden our prompts and what we write about in fantasy and science fiction?
That's a great question. In terms of kind of explicitly engaging with this particular question, the classic text of that really is Nisi Shaw's Writing the Other. And as a matter of fact, Nisi Shaw and Kay Timbus Bradford have a whole series of online workshops, which are fabulous resources. WritingTheOther.com, I think. I mean, you could just look up Writing the Other workshops, and they have a whole series of them, which are kind of asynchronous workshops with a whole bunch of different writing teachers and a whole lot of lots of different perspectives, and really thoughtful people grappling with these issues, and the kind of in the weeds nitty gritty of it, and also kind of general ideas of kind of more philosophical ideas of how to approach it. So, I mean, in terms of kind of people really kind of explicitly dealing with it, those are classics and really great resources. But I also think it's really important not just to not just stop there, because I think it's a little easy to kind of take even really good books that deal with this and turn them into sort of kind of didactic, like what to do and what not to do, which is what I was saying about the checkbox. It's a process, it's not something that like I have done and now I'm good. It's a different extra way of thinking that doesn't only, it has the fabulous benefit of helping you catch some problematic elements in your writing, like J.K. Rowling's Anti-Semitic Goblins, for example. But it also, it goes beyond that, right? It allows you to create this kind of deeper worlds in general. And so I feel like to that end, it's just really important to try to engage with work that might make you feel a little uncomfortable at first. The sort of stories that you can recognize that there's some merit there, but it's harder for you to find a way in, or it's harder for you to quite grasp what the writer is doing. I find that sticking with that, kind of acknowledging the feeling in a very kind of meditative way, but not just abandoning it, right? I'm not quite sure I get what's going on here, but I'm just going to keep going and see what happens. I feel that cultivating a bit of that discomfort, it's not to say read books you hate, but just like allowing yourself to be a little confused by a text and things like that is hugely helpful. because often I found that at some point it kind of clicks and I get more of what's going on. What I might get is like, oh, just like a whole other culture happening in this book. There's a whole like series of references and all sorts of things happen that I'm just not that privy to. And just getting that, it doesn't mean like I now understand the culture. It just means that I'm like, oh, I'm reading this from my own lens, but it turns out that it's actually coming at all of these questions from a different lens. And now that I even understand that, it's like easier for me to deal with the fact that I don't get everything. And I think that fantasy readers, especially fantasy science fiction readers, were great at that. I mean, like, who can sit around and spend 50 pages of a novel like and not understand a word of like who these like political factions are and who this person is and that person is? I mean, we've already developed this ability to kind of tolerate a bit of confusion. So it seems to me that, but we've only, but often we can only tolerate it like on one level, like the political confusion, right? But we need our taverns to look exactly like taverns. Like, just try to expand that a little.
Okay, Max asks, first off, fantastic keynote. He asks, which book that you've written using these methods was the most difficult or proudest that you would like us to know about?
Ooh. Well, I think I have to say my most recent novel, Trouble the Saints, and my short story collection, Reconstruction, came out like a few weeks ago. And it was delayed. It was supposed to come out in November, but it came out in January. And the title story, Reconstruction, was a doozy, and it really did require me to kind of just keep going back and keep thinking through how it was I was going to tell the story, especially in the case of Reconstruction, because as I was mentioning, like that notion of trying to interrogate even like what a story is. Your protagonist must protag. The main character of Reconstruction is a formerly enslaved laundress for the first South Carolina, which was one of the first Black regiments of the Civil War. And, she's a Black woman in the Civil War, which is to say, she was not occupying a principal position. She was not leading charges. She was not doing any of those things that we associate with like who we should follow in a Civil War story or in a war story. And I wanted to write her story, but it was a lot of kind of like adjusting myself to try to figure out like, how do I create a through line that doesn't follow that familiar arc? I mean, again, nothing I'm talking about or criticizing or saying we should interrogate. Like, they're all things I've done. They're all things that I'm also familiar with. Like, right. So it's also harder for me now. Although when I was younger, I did more experimentation with story structure. It was one of those kind of benefits of not knowing as much. I just didn't feel as much pressure, and now I know. Like I feel all that pressure, and so I'm kind of like trying to like relearn what I could do without really thinking about it when I was 25, and that was something that very much happened writing Reconstruction, was rediscovering how I could tell a story without that kind of straightforward narrative.
Excellent. Alyssa asks, how do you choose between ideas to explore first when you love them all?
Ooh. I'll tell you a secret, Alyssa. What I'll often do when I love them all is I will mash them up in one giant idea ball, and I will see if I can possibly construct a world that uses all of them. Like that's my go-to method. If there's just a whole lot of things like popping off in my brain, and it doesn't always work, but what I have discovered is that if they're all like just like calling to me, like Alaya, there's a reason, and there's often a lot of connections between them that I wasn't super aware of when they were just kind of like isolatedly like flashing. But when I decide to like round them all up and like I put them in the corral and I'm like, just be one story, like they often do end up becoming one story. And infecting each other in different ways that are really interesting.
Great. One last question. from Jennifer. What is currently capturing your imagination that you are cultivating?
Ooh. Well, what is currently capturing my imagination is a lot of quantum physics theory. So like, yeah, I know, but I just like, what are the implications of the arrow of time and a lot of like these cosmological arguments and like eternal of inflation and like the Everettian theory or interpretation of quantum mechanics. And I mean, I don't know if anybody knows what I'm talking about, but I cannot for the life of me like read a mathematical equation, but I'm like reading texts of philosophers discussing the implications of a lot of quantum mechanical experiments, and this stuff is just blowing my mind open, and it's filtering into my fiction. It's just I can't help it. It's just like wandering into my like giant space opera. Yes, in my giant YA space opera, I have a whole discussion of quantum mechanics because I just can't help myself.